While I'm waiting for you all to be let in, let me just say the way that the things are going to run this afternoon. We're going to hear first of all from the Regional President, Bernadette Hunter, and then we're moving on to Sinead McBrearty of Education Support, and we'll also hear from Andrew Morrish and Ros McMullen, co-founders of Headrest. We're going to be running a poll during the session, and there'll be an opportunity later on for you all to submit questions. Well, actually, you can submit questions right away. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. So if you want to submit your questions, have a look through any that have already been submitted. You can vote for your favourites, and those that are upvoted will go down the list in sort of order of popularity. If you do have any comments which aren't questions, please feel free to use the chat section. We'll be able to refer back to that, and we'll be able to add links as well to what people are referencing during their segments. Feel free to say hello to colleagues, introduce yourselves there, and let me know if you're having any technical difficulties as well. Just make sure you select everyone, panelists and attendees, when you're submitting your comments, if that's not already selected on your screen. Other than that, just to say, feel free to talk about the event on social media, but please don't include comments that people have written in the chat, because obviously we'd like to keep them within the community of the audience. And I think really that's about it. So I'm going to hand straight over to Bernadette Hunter, your Regional President.
So everybody, welcome to our second NHT West Midlands Region webinar, and thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. I know that you'll have so much going on in your own schools right now that it would have been difficult for you to prioritise this session. We all know that the well-being of school leaders and their staff has been impacted by the events of the last 12 months. So one of the most important things you can do right now is make time for yourselves and time to think about your own well-being and time to understand how you can protect yourself and care for yourself so that you can care for your staff and the children in your school. So hopefully today is going to give you some pointers to how to do that. And we look forward to answering your questions at the end of the sessions as well. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker today and welcome Sinead McBrearty from Education Support. Thanks, Sinead.
So my name is Bernadette, and I'm going to attempt to share my slides. And if it's not successful, somebody will shout at me and tell me they can't see any. I'm delighted to see so many of you here, and thanks a million for taking the time to come and join this conversation. Education Support is a charity that exists to improve the mental health and well-being of everyone working in education. And we've been working on that since 1877. So you might tell us to try and work a little harder here. And move a little faster. There's certainly plenty for us still to do and contribute to. But we do that work because we believe that well-being and mental health leads to better teaching and learning. It's as simple as that. And that's what drives our work. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening, what do we know, what does the data tell us about mental health and well-being, and then turn our attention a little bit to what we might be able to do about that. And I know that Ros and Andrew will have a lot more to say on that to you after I've finished as well. So by way of context, I think the first thing to say is that we've been researching the health of the workforce for some time. We ran our fourth Teacher Wellbeing Index last July. We ran the fieldwork for it, and that's looking at a sample of over 3,000 educators in England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, but most of the data that we have actually correlates to England. So this is quite an English picture. The East Midlands came out as the region in our most recent survey that had the lowest well-being for people working in education. So very pertinent to you all, I know. What I would say is that, look, if you put COVID to the side for a moment, if we're able to do that, basically, we are seeing very high levels of stress across the workforce in schools. It has plateaued, so it didn't get worse actually last year, notwithstanding COVID, but it's plateaued at a really high level and an unsustainable level. And so this is something that we bang on the door of the DFE about, and alongside organisations like the NAHT lobby for change around. Senior leaders particularly the data shows us are obviously, and you'll know this, under extreme stress at the moment. We've seen a spike to pretty much 90% of senior leaders describing themselves as stressed by the October half term just gone. And there is some evidence that that has increased further since. So we continue to look at that. We continue to talk to DFE. Making the case the case is fairly straightforward to make. Getting change to happen takes a little more, and so there's work for us to do on the policy side, I think, to make some change there. We're also seeing an increase in symptoms of poor mental health among senior leaders. Those symptoms in particular are insomnia, irritability, overeating, muscle tension, tearfulness, and difficulty concentrating. So those are the sorts of symptoms that have increased dramatically in the senior leader population over the last 12 months. And pretty much 30% of senior leaders disclosed that they had experienced mental health issues within the past academic year. That's pretty similar to previous years. It is slightly above the general population, it is above the general population, and that's true across education, that we see a higher level of incidence of mental health issues than we do in the wider population. Mental health support varies a lot between schools, and more than half of staff feel they don't have enough guidance about their mental health and well-being. That includes senior leaders who feel they don't have sufficient guidance. There are barriers to reaching out for help. There remains more stigma in education than there does in society at large around mental health. And so there's work here for us to do to normalize. And events like this are really important because it means we're having the conversation about mental health. We're talking about actions we can take to look after our own mental health. And we also begin to make it normal to ask for help, to look for support. And that's really, really important. Until everybody feels that it is a good and positive act to seek help and support, actually we're going to have the residue of stigma hanging around for a while yet. So the point I made there at the beginning, the well-being of people working in schools and colleges is lower than the general population. That remains a key driver for us in terms of what needs to happen to change that. We did some research after the first lockdown to try and understand what the impact was on people working in schools and colleges. And again, I don't think any of this will surprise you, but to give you the highlights, I think you're welcome to these slides, and all this data is on our website. There's actual data as opposed to just bullet points. You can see the graphs and the numbers if you're interested in them. COVID clearly has put a lot of downward pressure on mental health. Mental health is declining, and that's across the population. It is contested as to whether it's better or worse in schools. But from the data that we've seen from the ONS surveys and what we've recorded ourselves at a couple of different points in time, we think there's more pressure on the mental health, again, from COVID coming onto people working in schools. Appreciation has been the ray of sunshine in all of this, though. People working in schools reported a really high sense of feeling appreciated by the senior leaders and by colleagues. And senior leaders in school equally reported high levels of feeling appreciated by their boards and their governors. This is hugely important, not because, some people say, well, I don't feel appreciated. Really, do I care that teachers feel appreciated or don't? But of course, it's critically important because that sense of appreciation speaks to how confident we are that we're making a difference in the world, to our purpose, to our satisfaction. And that matters because if that is positive, it makes us more resilient. And when we are more resilient, we are less likely to become unwell. So appreciation is actually the one really strong positive message that came out of the first lockdown, that and collegiality. And the connection between colleagues, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, I think has been what's got so many schools through all of this in as good a nick as they are. That those relationships within schools matter so incredibly. Unfortunately, people working in schools don't feel appreciated by government. They don't feel appreciated by the general media. They feel fairly appreciated by the general public. And actually, if you look at things like the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index, in which they track what are the most trusted professions, educators, teachers are always in the top 5. I think they were 4th place in the 2020 index. But the public trusts teachers. There's a feeling that policymakers don't trust teachers, but we know the general public does. The other stuff we found in that survey were that the things that caused teacher stress were knowing whether or not children were completing work, the changing in government guidance, and the very significant workload. And of course, we know that hasn't changed. We haven't learned from the first lockdown to that regard. So we know that there will be pressure on staff right now. And the things that worry and make staff anxious, or did so in the first lockdown, were around their own personal health and safety, the learning priorities for children and young people, and what's happening with assessment, as well as pupil mental health. Those are the causes of anxiety and concern for people working in schools, be they leaders or classroom teachers. So that's what we understand. And I think it's helpful to know that, so that we don't have a sort of bigger set of things we might imagine are problematic, but we actually know what it is that does cause people anxiety. Overall, we have that picture of the baseline is high stress, high anxiety, high depression, and then the pandemic on top of that compounds a lot of that strain, though underneath it, it also appears to have strengthened the bonds between colleagues in the virtual staff room, if not the physical staff room for many. So what do we do about this? Well, we talk at Education Support, we talk about what are the levers for improvement, and we look at this at 3 levels. One is the individual. What do we do with individuals, for individuals? What do individuals do for themselves? The workplace, and the wider education system, the policy-making environment. And I would argue that addressing well-being at any one of those levels is great, but it's insufficient on its own. And the well-being of everybody working in education really exists at the intersection of these 3 things: what we're doing as individuals, what's happening in our own particular school that we're working in, and what's going on in the policy environment that's helping us to feel better or worse about the work that we do and how we are viewed, and the extent to which we feel we can influence what's happening in education. So if we look at those levers, and I'm going to go through the couple of these very quickly, but at the system level, you know, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but the big headlines that come through our research: accountability pressure is a significant issue. I have no problem. I'm a parent of young children. I have no problem with accountability itself, but I think how accountability is executed matters. The way in which accountability works is really important. And at the moment, it produces a lot of tension and anxiety, and this is not a positive thing in the education system. Professional identity and trust. The extent to which anyone working in schools, and particularly leaders, feel that they have some influence, they have a voice, they can contribute to decision-making on policy really matters. It's linked with our self-esteem, the overall well-being, and I think also plays out when we look at what causes people to leave the profession, and or conversely, what would make them stay. And so I think professional identity and trust is critically important there. And of course, workload. And that's the type of work, the volume of work. You know, the number of heads who are working 75 and 80 hours a week at the moment is, well, I've never seen the like of it. And also the intensity of work, you know, our working has become so intense. And so on these different dimensions, it matters. And these are factors of what's going on in the system rather than an individual workplace. You couldn't pick up a school from somewhere in England and say, yeah, everybody here can work 35 hours a week and get the job done. That's a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. There may be other big ticket systemic issues that you think are important. So let me know if there are. I'd love to hear more about your perspective. If we look then, so to go back to that triangle, we've talked about the system. If we look at workplace, well, there's a whole host of things that matter in terms of well-being in the workplace. And, you know, that's everything from the school knowing what it wants to achieve in terms of well-being, having the right leadership and the right culture. And leadership, your leadership is really important here. You set the tone and you role model the way in which people take care of themselves. I see this as a leader of a charity. You know, I can, until I'm blue in the face, I can tell people to take care of themselves. But if they see me not doing that, if they see me working silly hours and not prioritizing my own well-being, then it doesn't resonate in the same way that it does if they see I'm going to go and take time to have a walk and get some fresh air. So your role as a role model for others is one of the most powerful things you can do to create a culture of self-care, of well-being, and of positive actions around mental health in your own school environment. I think on the culture side, this point about collegiality is really important, and it's hard. So on the one hand, we've seen that sense of colleagues working together come to the fore as a real positive during COVID. But I know there's a lot of strain there as well, because people cannot work together in ways that they typically would. And there's a lot of isolation, particularly in secondary schools. We're hearing of a lot of people who feel quite isolated from colleagues. So one of the things that I think is hugely important is the way in which we can bring people together and harness that sense of collegiality. And I think when you look at headship and senior leaders more broadly, the ways in which we can create connection between heads are really important. I know Ross and Andrew will probably talk about this as well. But you know, we've looked a lot and put a lot of investment into bringing together peer groups of heads. And the reason for it is when you can create that sense of community and connection from people who have that professional bond in common, it gives them a very different type of space to discuss the issues and what they get from the experience of others, the insight from others, and the freedom to disclose safely, you know, to take off the mask of headship and freely discuss what's actually going on for them. That's a really positive development. But I think we see that also within schools, within workplaces, that kind of space for collegiality is encouraged. And where it is, we see better well-being and better mental health. Self-efficacy is very important. That's our sense of being able to make a difference. And so making sure within the school that there's a culture of people being able to see and understand and focus on the areas where they make a difference matters to creating positive mental health and positive well-being. And then there are a range of other things that you can use, whether it's a baseline survey to tell you what's happening in the school. Ideally, you do that with some kind of an independent tool or involve governors or the board in overseeing it so that there really is a clear channel and there's transparency around where the information in that goes. If you need them, there are stress risk assessments from the health and safety executive. There's all manner of policies and practices that can be helpful. Access to counselling, I advocate for. I think it's important that people can pick the phone up and access a qualified professional if they need to have a conversation. And we have a free helpline for anywhere that isn't the case. I'll give you the number at the end. And then there's, you know, some common language across the school can be very helpful, whether that's on mental health awareness, personal well-being. There's an awful lot that matters inside line management relationships that affects well-being and mental health, and actually being able to give and receive feedback is a really important skill in the workplace to keeping us well. If we then turn to the individual, so we've looked at the system, we've looked at the workplace. When it comes to the individual, workload really matters. It really affects how we feel, and it's the single biggest reason cited by those who are leaving the profession in too large a number. So workload is critically important. Autonomy matters, and it matters for senior leaders, and sometimes this particular topic matters to people who are maybe head of school in a wider trust community, where they don't feel that they have the same degree of control that they used to have over their experience and their leadership approach. There is something to be discussed there about the balance between the extent of demand on somebody and the amount of control that they have around how they respond to that. When they have high demand and low control as a kind of operating principle, this really has a negative impact on people's well-being and their mental health. And there's there are only two things you can do differently about it. You can either reduce the demand on them, which is very difficult in this circumstance, or you can increase their control and give them far more ability to choose how they do things. So for individuals, this we know makes a big difference. I want to say a bit about the emotional content of the role. We see a lot of people working across education carrying a lot of emotional outcome, if you like, from the work that they do. And it's not widely discussed and it's not widely acknowledged. But if you're a school leader, if you're a safeguarding lead, if you're a SEMCO, if you are actually an assistant or a deputy head in most schools, you are probably encountering a lot of circumstances, issues, stories, experiences that affect you and that leave you with a lot of feeling. And you probably don't, 9 out of 10 of you in that situation don't have anywhere to discuss that. And I think this is something that is really important and something we need to try and improve how we operate across the whole of education on. But the first step is probably recognizing that it's really important to reflect on what the impact on you is, so that you might begin to be able to discuss it with a trusted colleague, a friend, a loved one. You can use our helpline. You can find support in lots of places. And again, Andrew and Roz will talk about what they can do to support on this. But I think the first step is acknowledging that sometimes we've got too much, and sometimes the emotional content does affect us personally. And that's a boundary that if we can get a handle on, if we can begin to recognize, I think we can improve our well-being, because in recognizing it, we can find some strategies for managing it. So I think that's one of the things that we see a lot in this crisis, whether it's to do with the economic fallout of COVID, or school communities that have experienced tremendous bereavement, or the terrible things that happen when people are locked in their houses for a year. You know, any one of those things will be a trigger point for that. I think the other thing I'd say, just when it comes to the individual, is it's also for all of us, you know, it's not so much about thinking about the other individuals in the school. This is now a moment for us to reflect on ourselves, and it's not, nor is it about judging decisions particularly, actually, but I think we all need to take a moment and just reflect on our own choices and our own decisions, and what it is that we choose to prioritize, and what we can do to support our own well-being. And some of it is easy and very doable. You know, I find some aspects of well-being straightforward. I'm good at treating myself. That comes quite naturally to me. I'm less good at taking aerobic exercise. Some would say I'm allergic to it. And yet I know that I have to take responsibility for that if I want to stay well. I know if I don't get out and get air, if I don't move my body, I simply won't feel well. But having the discipline to execute that, you know, is less instinctive in me than, you know, having a glass of wine as a way of finishing off a good week. You know, that's much easier. But I think we need to just review our own decisions and just check in with ourselves and see, are we doing the basic things that we could do to keep ourselves well? I think one of the things that we know about people working in education is they care for others. You know, that's a big part of what's brought them into their work. It's quite core, it's quite a centrally held value. And sometimes it can feel like it's the opposite of that, to look after yourself. And actually, I think it's really important that we dismiss that as a myth and as a somewhat Victorian attitude, actually. Self-care is definitely not self-indulgence. There is a wealth of literature that will tell you that if you look after yourself well, you'll live longer, you'll live happier, you'll be less unwell in your life. There is all sorts of evidence that speaks to how important self-care is. And in caring for yourself, you're not taking away from the school, you're not doing less for the community, you're not doing less for the kids. You know, it is actually a kind of a part of your professional practice, actually, is looking after yourself. Because unless you are in the best possible condition you can be in, you know, if you haven't looked after yourself to that extent, you're not going to be able to do as good a job. We're all very good at developing ourselves or you know, getting things done, and our culture focuses on getting things done. But rest is really an essential part of staying well in this moment. And I think that's also about recognizing that the opposite of working isn't not working. You can be not working and your head be full of it, and you know, that part of your brain buzzing away. Actually, you need to make sure that you've allowed yourself to become fully absorbed in something else, to really let the kind of psychological and emotional processes of rest happen. So if you do nothing else, find something every day for 10 or 15 minutes that you can become absorbed in, and allow your body to kind of have that 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, I'd say take an hour, like, but if you're really struggling, find 10. Bill Clinton, when he was president of the United States, used to take an hour every day in his diary to go and sit and read in the White House Library. If the president of the United States can find an hour in the day to look after himself, then I don't think any of the rest of us can say that we can't. But 10 minutes is all I'm asking you to do. But I think those 10 minutes really, really matter. And you know, that's all part of the same piece that again, we have very strong evidence for. That kind of self-compassion is strongly correlated to having fewer mental health symptoms, suffering less from depression, less anxiety, less stress, and better overall health and happiness insofar as we can measure these things. Just to say, there are some signs to watch out for, and these are to watch out for in ourselves, as well as our loved ones, as well as our colleagues, really anyone that you're interacting with. And some of these things might just be, you know, you're having a particular experience on the day and there's nothing too much to worry about. But if you find yourself having patterns of these symptoms, then it's probably a good moment to stop and just, you know, think how you are and to really take a moment to reflect. Whether you do that on your own, whether you do it with somebody you trust, whether you use our helpline and have a conversation with a trained counsellor, that's a really good use of our helpline. We'd love people to be doing that kind of check-in. And if it's with another person, stopping long enough to have the conversation with them to just see how they are and how they really are, I think becomes really important. But where we notice people not doing well, it's important that we speak to them and that we try and bring it to their attention. And if somebody else brings to your attention that you're a bit snippy, you're a bit short-tempered, you're a bit, you know, off color, then don't dismiss it and don't get cross with them for saying it to you. Actually stop for a minute and just think, what does that mean? What does that tell me about how I am and how I'm doing? Some very basic points that I have to I have to say to you because these matter. There are some fundamentally simple things that we can do that genuinely, that's documented in the literature, will support our mental health. Recognizing and accepting that a whole host of responses right now is normal, both in you and in others. It's a pandemic. These things happen once a century. We're all allowed and entitled to any response that we have, and you don't have to judge yourself or feel embarrassed or ashamed about it. And obviously, you know, what people do with the feelings they have, sometimes the action that follows isn't appropriate, but the feeling, you're allowed to have those, and that's okay. And so accepting that is something that you can do and not make it any more of a thing of it. Taking exercise is hugely important. You just need to get up and walk. You know, you don't have to run a marathon, just walk for half an hour a day. That in itself will make a massive difference. Eating well, making sure that you have good, nutritious food going in and you're taking it easy on the sugar and the alcohol. This is, again, oodles of evidence to tell us this keeps us mentally and emotionally in better nick than doing the opposite. Having good sleep habits, put the phone away, you know, read a couple of lines, it rests the brain, whatever it is that works for you, do it. And be careful on social media. There is a lot of anger in a lot of places on social media, and some of it is very easy to tap into. And then you have all those feelings, they all transfer into you. There's fantastic communities of support in social media too. So it's not saying a blanket, you know, be careful. It's just saying be thoughtful about what you engage in and the effect that it has on you when you engage in it. Expressing gratitude is, again, I kind of dismissed this when I got into this mental health malarkey. I thought, oh, gratitude, really? But if you read the evidence and you try it out, actually finding 3 things to be grateful for every day genuinely does make a difference to how you feel and to your sense of well-being and to your perspective in the world. Psychologically, it shifts us into a better frame of mind. Now, there are things going on at the moment that all the gratitude in the world aren't going to mitigate, but it still helps inside yourself to try and orient to some of the good stuff. Be creative, get out into nature, talk about how you feel, do that with people you trust. And I think the last thing is accepting the uncertainty. None of us can control this. None of us can make it go a certain way. None of us can knock some sense into the policy environment. You know, that's just not something that we can do, or at least we can't do it overnight. And there's a lot of relief that comes from saying, okay, this is crazy. It's all a bit mad. I don't know what's going to happen next. You know, Ross made the point when we were getting ready for this, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? You don't know. And that can drive you mad with anxiety. And actually, again, what we know from a lot of psychological evidence is if you can accept it and say, okay, it is uncertain. I'm not going to try and second guess it. And I'm not going to have a big response about what it is or it isn't. I'm going to deal with what is happening today and what's in front of me and do the things that I can control. If you're able to look at it that way, you will be better in yourself. Your well-being will be better and you'll be less stressed and less anxious. We do a bunch of things. For anyone who doesn't know, it's all on our website. We support people and workplaces, and we research all this stuff and try and lobby for a better school environment, I suppose, a better education sector. This helpline is available to anyone who works in education 24/7. There are trained counsellors on the end of the phone. It was set up by teachers for teachers. We deal with thousands of calls every year, and we're delighted to have many more. So there's never a reason not to call, and you don't need to be in crisis to use the helpline. There's also the NAHT helpline, which I imagine the number will be shared later on. So, you know, we work with NAHT on that. So the support is there, you know, use it. There's a bunch of resources on our website, and I'll put up some contact details there. If there's anything else you want or need, then if we can't do it, we'll try and find somebody else who can. I should stop there, Natalie.
Thank you very much for that, Sinead. And you've kept very well to time there as well. Thank you. I think, I mean, that's some really good advice. I'm hoping that there's a good number of people actually attending this webinar. We were discussing just before we went live how with about 120 people registered, it seems to be the way so often at the moment that live events have quite a large drop-off rate because of obviously what's happening and people having to take their time elsewhere. So it's fantastic. We've got 75 people watching live, and I'm sure lots of them will be really appreciative of that first presentation from you, Sinead. Thank you. Just want to encourage you all to submit your questions. We've only had a couple so far in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. After we've heard from Andrew and Ros, we're going to be taking questions. So just if I can ask you to make the most of this opportunity to put your questions and your thoughts to the experts while we've got them here for you. And a reminder as well that we are recording this. So those people who have registered who aren't able to attend live will actually be able to see a link to the recording in the near future as well. Right, so with that, I'm going to hand over to Andrew and Ros. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, everyone. It's fantastic that you're able to find some time in your hectic schedules. I'm sure things out there are totally unprecedented at the moment, and one of the, I think, real challenges that we find, certainly with the stuff that we do at Headrest, is trying to kind of moderate this to some sense of what actually is the norm that's going on out there at the moment. Ross will tell you a little bit more about why we set the whole venture up just very shortly, but both Ros and I have been in the game for a long time. You know, I've been ahead for 20 odd years. Last 7 or 8 of that was as a chief exec, working across West Midlands, supporting across a number of schools as a NLE as well. And it's become increasingly more clear, I think, over the years as we've become system leaders. You know, the system itself, it's incumbent that we find ways to, I guess, make that system work for ourselves. And I think one of the key kind of fundamental pillars behind Headrest is that it is head teachers, existing head teachers, colleagues that have been there, sat in the chair, understand how difficult it is, that are there to a certain extent to give you support and advice. And I think one of the things that we're very clear about at Headrest, in fact, is that the advice bit is actually the one thing that we don't want to be doing. You know, the element of what we do is around handoff and making sure that we can listen to you and give you good advice in terms of where to go next. So one of the things that we don't do, which is why it's fantastic here in Sinead, is obviously offer any kind of counselling or any kind of real expert insight into anything, around that. But what we can do is talk to you as a head teacher who's been there, and can listen. And I think one of the most important things that I found when I was running a school, you know, it's a very, very lonely job. And when you're working within an organization, there are very few people, if anybody, who you can go to other than your friends or your family at home, and can offload. And I think ultimately that's why Headrest was set up, because it became increasingly clear that there are a number of heads, more than ever, that I've come across, who desperately need to talk to somebody without necessarily going through any formal channels, you know, without going to the unions, or without necessarily starting conversations with governing bodies, who just need someone to listen. And Ros, that was partly why you kind of got involved and came, you know, you put a call out, didn't you, to some of your colleagues that you've worked with about what can we do about this?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I guess one of the things that resonated with me when Sinead was speaking was about that sort of real special nature of headship, in that there is nobody else that you can talk to. The truth is, if you haven't been a head teacher, you actually don't know how it feels to be the person in the chair. I took early retirement to begin to work independently, having been a CEO and an executive principal. My background secondary, just before all this pandemic business. And I've never had to deal with it, but I have had to deal with lots and lots and lots of things. And I just got really concerned, because in the various DM threads, I'm one of the Head Teachers Roundtable gang, one of the original people who set up Heads Roundtable. And so I'm in touch with a lot of heads, and I also coach and support exec principals and CEOs mainly. So I was kind of picking up just how much stress heads were under. And I felt really, well, I think I always say, the thing I always say is it's that mixture of relief that I wasn't actually having to run a school during this awful time, but also incredible guilt that actually I wasn't in the system of running schools, and how could I possibly help? And it occurred to me that people like me, who are still sort of working to support in the system and have years of successful experience as heads and who understand how heads feel, could actually be, make some sort of contribution. So I reached out to a few people. Andrew was one of them. And he immediately responded and said, look, why don't we set up this thing? And there's 4 of us involved, me with a secondary background, and also Kenny Frederick, who has a secondary background. Andrew has a primary background, and also Pete Crockett, who has a special school background, and also is a very experienced governor now as well. And so we said, well, you know, we know the job. If people just want to talk to a head who can understand and empathise and just speak to somebody. Because quite often, as Andrew says, it's not about us giving specialist legal advice or HR advice or anything, but it is about us saying, yeah, we know. And actually, if I was experiencing this at this time, these are the people I would be talking to. This is the direction I would be going in order just to share some of that experience. But mainly, if I'm honest, it is about listening. What we're finding is that a lot of people will say, I can't believe that it's come to this. I can't believe I need to talk to somebody. Well, I can, because I need to talk to people who understand the position I'm in when I'm feeling particularly under pressure, under stress. But it's often the thing that's made them pick up the phone or DM us to request a conversation is some sort of final straw. And those final straws are very much around the sort of things that Sinead was talking about in her presentation. One of the key ones I would say is accountability. And one of the things that I've formed quite a strong impression of is that a lot of heads are being fantastically and brilliantly supported by their MATs or by their local authorities, and will often say, you know, God, I couldn't have got through this without them. But there are also those who are, well, it seems quite a toxic situation, where on top of everything else, some of the accountability pressures are just being used to hammer heads. And when they're having to deal with keeping all their staff going and absorb all the emotional stress from the staff, quite often accountability pressures monitoring, etc., can be the final straw. But other final straws as well that people sometimes just need to offload, and they feel so much better when they have just sort of talked to somebody who can say, yeah, that would have that would have really annoyed me as well. It can be just little things like, the email from a local counsellor, complaining because a parent has complained to them, when absolutely everything has been done. And also, I think that one of the things that heads were finding that was really tipping heads over the edge in terms of needing to speak to other heads about it was just this constantly changing advice situation that we were in. Plans drawn up, last minute changes, just made things really, really difficult. There are particular things that we are forming an opinion about at Headrest, and about the heads that we feel are particularly vulnerable. And I'm going to pass to Andrew on this, because Andrew has picked up quite a lot about heads who are new to post, and some of the isolation and the real difficulties around head teacher induction at this time, and where Headrest has been able to hear about this and offer some support.
Yeah, thanks, Ros. I think that's absolutely true, and it's what's become such a stark reality is just how jolly difficult it must be out there to be a new head teacher at the moment. When you think about when you first became a head teacher or you took up a senior post, incumbent on that was some kind of, I guess, not necessarily an entitlement, because I guess we're not entitled to anything in many ways, but because it costs money and budget is very tight. But it's amazing how many new head teachers, just for example, don't have a mentor or a coach. And one of the things that I'm finding at the moment is that young head teachers just got nowhere to go. New head teachers have got nowhere to go. They can't, even if they're within a multi-academy trust or a really good local authority or within a network, physically they're just not able to meet up with people. They're not able to go down and visit other people's schools. So talking to them is a real challenge. So I think moving forward, there's a piece of work certainly that we've got to do as a profession when we return back to the new normal. And that, by the way, is another theme that's coming through. There's a lot of frustration about what do we do? How can we now seize the moment, having got ourselves into this sort of pressure cooker situation? How can we make sure that as we ease our way back into schools, that there's a better way, there's a different way? And I think going forward, one of the challenges that Headrest and all the other organisations out there, because we're by no means the only one that does that, but we've got to simply as a profession, I think, come together and try and find ways through this so that heads do have support networks. Now, I know at the moment, for example, some of you may well be involved with the MPQs, and the MPQs themselves are being remodeled for September. And one of the sort of key issues within those is kind of this body of knowledge. What is the stuff that heads need to know? What is it that people need to be aware of? And I think one of the real stresses, particularly for new leaders, is that perhaps they don't necessarily know what it is that they need to be doing. So a lot of what we do is about sort of reassuring people, reaffirming, helping them to recalibrate and kind of take stock of where they are. So yeah, I think some kind of national mentoring framework or coaching entitlement going forward, I think, is crucial. And Ros and I were talking only last week about when we first started as heads, and I remember starting, I became a head in 1999, and it was pretty much at the start when the new National Leadership College was launched, and it was all very exciting. And I think it was a couple of £1,000 or so. I think it was called Headlamp. Some of you may remember it yourself if you've been in the game as long as we have, but Head Teachers Leadership and Management Programme. And I got a couple of £1,000, and part of my induction was to go out and find a coach and spend 6 months with somebody outside education and meet with them. And I found it, incredibly useful and incredibly powerful. And it's just making sure that, I suppose, that at Headrest we can do that. We can provide that service to a certain, a number of people. I think as well, when you look on the website, Headrest is very much seen as being a safety device. And I think what's important with the work that we do is that a lot of the feedback, people tell us that it's reassuring to know that you're there, and that we hope that we'll never ever actually have to use you. We're kind of that kind of ultimate insurance policy for heads that are out there. And I think the other thing that's important is that, because a lot of people that call us, they don't want to remain anonymous necessarily, but they're obviously anxious to disclose too much information in terms of getting themselves into a compromising situation. So that's where it's really important, and we're delighted to be invited by NAHT today to be able to point people in the right direction. And I think NAHT understand only too well that by the time it gets to them, often it is last chance saloon, and we don't want any of our colleagues to necessarily get themselves into that situation. I mean, Ros, you'll recall a call that you took, and you've done, you do this far better than I do, or whether it's just luck that you picked them up. But, head teachers literally on the phone in tears, where we really thought that we were going to have to refer them onto counselling. And, that was a real issue for you, Ros. I mean, how did you deal with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a huge variety of calls. I mean, quite often somebody just wants to rant to somebody who can understand and turn their ranting into laughter, because actually, head to head, you can have a good laugh sometimes once you've got the rant out, rather than going to sleep without having the ability to rant. But yes, Andrew's right. I mean, there have been some very distressing calls. We had we had a call where all we could hear on the answer phone was sobbing, and then the phone being put down. But luckily, we could see the number the call had come from, and I think that's the one that you're referring to, Andrew.
Yeah, and I think was what's really important here as well. And maybe this is for you as head teachers to go back and have that conversation back in your schools. But you can't underestimate the important role the governing bodies play in this whole situation here. Because I remember, as a head teacher, I think one of the things that I always tried to do and always believed in was the importance of creating a really great culture in your school. And we know that culture isn't something that you can just fix and build overnight. It can take several years, sometimes 5 or 6 years, to build a really great culture. And you set it up, and all of your evaluations that you do, all the feedback that you get back from your staff, all the appraisals, all the 360s, point to a really supportive culture, and everybody feels that they can go to somebody else if they've got a problem. That's fantastic. Until then, you find you as the head teacher, when you yourself are in that situation, you realize that actually none of that makes any difference whatsoever, for the one simple reason, and that is that you're the one in charge. The buck stops with you. There is nobody else for you to go to. You realize that kind of environment that you've created, in your role as being a servant leader, for example, or as I said earlier, a system leader, just the very notion of being accountable and being in charge, that the kind of sword of Damocles hanging over your head all the time. I don't want to paint a picture of doom and gloom here, not by any stretch, but I think it's that unique position where as a head you feel so vulnerable. And I think where do you turn to? Who can you go to? I've been very lucky, having my wife's in the teaching profession, so she understands entirely what it's like. But I can imagine that for some people where they haven't got that support network and they don't understand necessarily what the job involves around teaching, it's so difficult. So I think going forward, if one thing that we can do with Headrest, and I know, Ros, you do it brilliantly well with the Teachers Roundtable, is keep on the agenda all the time, putting pressure, lobbying, not forcing, I suppose that's the wrong word, but trying to get the government, trying to get the department to understand how important head teacher wellbeing is. And then unless we address this and come up with some real kind of common entitlement model, some kind of framework where, there's no other profession, I'm sure, where for a chief executive, for example, of a big company, or a head teacher running a huge budget, doesn't have a coach, for example. It just seems ridiculous that's not out there. And of course, the reason why we don't do it as heads is because we know it costs money, and we feel guilty, and we don't end up spending our budget on ourselves. And so I think one of the key messages always around Headrest, and it's a bit of a cliche, but it is that one about always making sure that you put the safety mask on yourself first. And as head teachers and as school leaders, we just simply don't do enough of that. So I think it's really important that if you take nothing away from this session today, that you go back and you realize that the whole welfare, the whole organizational culture, the whole, I guess, sort of future in some ways of how effective your organization is throughout this hangs entirely on you as the school leader. So on our website, for example, what we started to do now is to get some posts, some blog posts out, and they're fantastic. And by the way, if any of you out there watching, any of the 70 odd of you are interested in putting something on our website, we love to share it, because I think it adds authenticity and real integrity when it's real sort of personal pieces written by people that have been there and are doing the job. So, you know, hopefully over the next few months we can build up some resources for people to have a look at and go to and link up to. So I think pretty much, Ros, we're almost done there now. I think you maybe got a couple more points just to wrap up.
I was just thinking while you were talking, Andrew, of this sort of, you know, how we would sort of summarize the service. I mean, the website and the Andrew runs the website, because I'm not technical at all, and he's got all these wonderful blogs up that people have put up, which is really helpful. But in terms of the calls we take, I would say there are really three things that we're doing. One is that we're just letting people rant. We're just, you know, somebody who understands that they can have a good old rant to. We're a signpost, so when people are in distress and they really do need to be signposted to HR advice, legal advice, a good counselling service, whatever, we can signpost. But a very big part, and I know if Peter was here, Andrew, Peter would want to say this, a big part of what we do is we reassure, because quite often, you know, we as head teachers, we emanate confidence in our leadership. We're absorbing the stresses, the anxieties and the uncertainties of other people, and we're demonstrating confidence in leadership. But actually, we need some reassurance that we're doing it right. And I think particularly in the special school sector, and I don't know if any of today's participants are from the special sector, but I know you've been particularly hit with an awful lot of problems. And what Peter has found is that he's giving a lot of reassurance of saying, yeah, I'd have done that. Yeah, you're doing it right. That's been a big part of it. And I think really what I would sort of finish on in terms of the whole advice around mental health and well-being and all the rest of it is something that I know Michael Payne, who runs Forum Strategy, is talking about a lot, which is about trying to keep yourself within the zone that you can control. You know, when Sinead was talking about the things that, you know, that thing about not knowing what's going to happen next, fear of the uncertainty, you know, what are the DFE going to publish at 11:30 tonight? Should I keep checking the website? Should I keep checking my emails? You know, when we're really worried about all of those things that are completely out of our control, try and keep yourself inside that zone of control. Okay, so what do I need to worry about today? You know, what do I need to do today in order that tomorrow goes okay? And just keeping yourself in that zone of the things that you can control, and not wasting the emotional energy and the stress on all those things outside that we can't. And so we do quite a bit of that as well, I would say. So that's really the service we offer. And if you want to get in contact with Headrest, what we do is we have the free phone number, which I suppose I ought to put in the chat, and I will in a minute. Or Andrew, you could do that while I'm talking. I find it difficult, you know, at my age to type and talk at the same time. Didn't used to have a problem with that. Happens in your late 50s, guys. So you can ring the free phone number, leave an answer phone message, we get back to you, or you can DM us on Twitter, or you can visit our website, which is headrestuk.co.uk. And what we do is we sort of, triage is the wrong word, we sort of put the calls to the right person. So if things come in from a special school head teacher, we try to get Pete to deal with them. Andrew tends to mop up the primary stuff, and I tend to mop up the secondary stuff with Kenny, although it does vary, you know, because it just depends who's available. I don't honestly think, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we have ever not been able to respond the same day.
I think often, Ros, we've done it within sort of half an hour. I see one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A is around, you know, the office hours for Headrest, but it is, you know, originally we tried to just keep ourselves in a window of just sort of between 7 and 8 every evening, but we find that people are getting in touch with us all the time, and so one of us will always try and get back to you, you know, within an hour or so, and if we can't talk there and then, we'll arrange a time to do that. And
we do have, you know, hotspots. Sunday evenings can be hotspots for obvious reasons, I would imagine. And so we do have households, but generally speaking, and because the four of us who are involved at the moment aren't running schools in the morning, generally, if somebody needs to talk before they go to sleep, we are able to deal with that in the late evening, and I don't think we've ever not been able to. One of the things we have had a lot of colleagues approach us to say, oh, I'd like to be involved and support the work of Headrest. But one of the things that I'm quite precious about, and I know Andrew is exactly the same, is that this is a service provided by head teachers. So, you know, if somebody who has been a local authority advisor or something wants to take the calls, we've actually sort of said thank you very much, but actually this is for people who've sat in the chair. So we want head teachers, if they ring Headrest, to know they are talking to a head teacher, because we believe it's only head teachers who know. So we do have the four of us have got a reserve list. We have got a few other heads who we know and we absolutely trust, and they're on our reserve list in case we ever have an evening where we just can't cope with the volume of calls. We haven't had to use that reserve list yet, but I just want to reassure everybody that you will never be in a situation, if you want to talk to a head teacher at Headrest, of being put in touch with somebody who isn't a head. That will never happen. It is a service provided by heads, and of course, and we don't really need to say this, it is completely and totally confidential and completely and totally free. Although Andrew does end up offering his services pro bono to new heads, which isn't a good business model for his company, but never mind.
I think that's about it. So thank you very much. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Ros. It's really interesting to hear more about the service that you offer, actually, and I'm pleased the details are in the chat as well. Really, I think really reassuring as well for the heads that are wanting to contact you to know that the people that they speak to are people that have been in the same position themselves. So thank you. Before I go into the Q&A, I just want to draw everybody's attention to some polls which have now become available at the bottom of your screen. One of the reasons that we're holding this webinar within West Midlands is that we obviously, with the current climate, we want to make sure that we're offering a programme of events which are suited to the membership and that is relevant. And obviously we recognise that wellbeing is indeed a focus that we need to be paying attention to. So with that in mind, we have some questions which you've already started answering, which is really good. First question, would you be interested in attending a webinar on supporting pupil wellbeing in the context of COVID? Second question, would you be interested in attending a further session on staff wellbeing? And third question, would you be interested in further sessions to support your own wellbeing? So thank you if you already started to answer those. Do, if you can, take the time to do that if you haven't yet during the Q&A. We won't revisit them, we're just going to take that information away to work on our programme that we're going to be offering you as the year unfolds. Thank you for that. So we had some questions and we've got Bernadette and Sinead back with us as well. I'm going to go to the question at the top of the list first of all, and do feel free to keep adding questions as well if any come to you during this part of the session. This is from Michelle Ward. I'm in a very small school of 60 pupils. I am the senior leadership team along with the governors. I'm also a teaching head 2 days per week. How do other heads in the same situation manage workload and delegation when there is no deputy or assistant head? I don't know if anyone has got any examples or knowledge of those situations.
Well, I mean, I can possibly go first here. I mean, Ros just mentioned at the end there about the fact that, you know, sort of picking up head teachers and giving them some support pro bono. I mean, this is a classic example of a new head teacher. She started in September and she's got a school, you know, down south, and it's, I think, got 45 pupils, very, very small rural school, and she works only part-time, so she's only there 2 or 3 days a week, got a full-time teaching commitment, and obviously all the pressures of budget that goes with it and all the COVID stuff, and is new in post and has got no school within miles of her, no support network. And so I said to her, well, have you got a mentor? Surely you've got a mentor. And of course she sort of said, well, what's that? And I said, well, you must have a mentor. So I said, well, I'll do it. So I've been working with her and supporting her. And I think one of the key key issues that she's got it is essentially the relationship with the governing body. So I think one of the things that I'm helping her through is to get those kind of lines of communication open. It was a very sort of traditional, old school governing body that perhaps just doesn't appreciate the challenges that heads face in those sort of scenarios. She's not in a multi-academy trust, so there's no way that she can sort of work across that particular system. But it was also about giving her kind of the not the authority, but I suppose the confidence to also sort of contact the local authority more as well. I think she felt a little bit reluctant to do that. So she's reached out to the LA, and I'm hoping that they can acknowledge that she's a new head and she needs support. Notwithstanding the fact that, whether you've got 60 pupils or 600, you've still got to do exactly the same job. You've got to do all the same returns. You've got all the same accountability pressures. It's absolutely no different. So I think that's a real tough one for head teachers in small schools, which again, I think goes back to the fact that, the DFE and the government tend to sometimes think that schools are only secondary schools with thousands of pupils, and that at primary, all we're here to do is just simply babysit and look after the kids so that parents can go to work and we're keeping the economy going, so that all the real learning takes place elsewhere. I mean, I'm being obviously rather facetious there, and I don't want to do a disservice to any of my secondary colleagues because they do a fantastic job. But I think the point that Michelle raised there is a real challenging one, and I'm sure it's one that NEHT are very, very aware of as well, and are doing great stuff to support behind the scenes.
Thanks, Andrew. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Bernadette?
Yes, I think this really raises the point that one of the key things for any head teacher, but particularly for new head teachers and small school head teachers, is networks. I was a head of a very small school many, many moons ago, and our local authority had a really well-developed small schools network, which was incredibly supportive. Now, those days are gone in terms of local authorities' capacity to provide that kind of support for schools now. But I think if schools can get themselves together, where they're not in multi-academy trusts, and get themselves into some kind of even an informal loose network arrangement, it certainly helps. Heads don't feel quite so on their own and so lonely. And if you're a brand new head, that's going to be really difficult. So I think it's quite incumbent on those of us who are more experienced head teachers to be looking out to see where are new heads in our area, where are those schools that are outside of the normal circles of networks, where are those schools that aren't interacting with anyone else. So as a profession, we can start to support other people as well, given that there aren't any other sort of systems of support out there.
Thanks, Bernadette. Ros?
Yeah, I just kind of reflecting around the whole sort of new head teachers at this time. Andrew and I were talking about this some time ago, that when you start as a head teacher, one of the things that you're really concerned about is building the relationships and building the culture of your school. And your sort of systems and your processes and your operations flow from that. The problem at the moment is that new heads are being inducted in a situation where they can't do the relationships bit and the culture bit, because the school isn't there as a school. It's sort of, so they're starting very much around operations and processes. And that has huge implications actually for a generation of head teachers coming through. And somebody needs to be giving some thought to that. So head teachers that are being inducted into headship at this time, not only is this really difficult and we need to support them and we need to band together, but we actually need to give some real thought to what the implications are for that generation of head teachers going forward and schools. And I think we need to have some work done on that. And that might be something NHT want to have a look at with us, because that is a real concern of mine.
Thank you, Sinead.
Just to add in, I think it's really, I think that's an incredibly difficult situation to be in, and I hope you have strong support, because I think that the quality of support that's there in the school, whether it's if there's any kind of office team or whatever it is that's available, I think it's going to matter a lot. But I think having a conversation with the chair of governors is also, it sounds like your governors are involved, but I think is also really important from the perspective of boundaries. in the role that you're in and being a teaching head, I think you could work, you know, every hour of the week, night and day, and you probably still wouldn't necessarily complete everything that technically needs to be done. So I think there's some decisions around whether you drop something or you put it down, you know. You can't get everything done, and so being choiceful about what really prioritizing. It's some of the things that we've heard coming through from the head teachers we work with, is there's a kind of ruthlessness around paring back. And I don't doubt you will already have done that, but I think to do it with maybe the chair of governors and ask them explicitly to help you work out where to draw that boundary. So you're not sitting with that yourself. I think I would just throw into the mix as something that is worth thinking about.
Thank you. And Elaine Huntington has also shared, if you haven't seen the comments, her experience and some practical advice. So thank you for that, Elaine. The next question comes from Andrew Carey, and he asks, what examples of best practice have you seen in schools where well-being is placed at the heart of the school? Actions with low input but high output would certainly help with the pressures senior leaders are currently under. Sinead?
So I think I think in terms of best practice, there's actually, I'm not sure that there is a set of case studies that are easily replicable. We find there are themes really that tend to be helpful and speak to best practice. In terms of the high impact, low input, high impact stuff, I'm sorry to say that's tricky. And I would love nothing more than to be able to give you a magic bullet on it. But really the foundational stuff in the best schools, with the best, in the schools that deal with well-being in the best possible way, the foundation is culture and leadership in that school. And that's about the relationships and investing in the relationships, making sure that there's openness and transparency. The other point that's really key from a relationship perspective is we see a lot of poor line management in schools, not just schools, we see poor line management everywhere. And it has a profound effect on well-being, but thinking about the skills that exist in middle management, in any role that has a managerial element. And of course, in special schools, that's the teacher in the classroom. But I think that becomes really, really important because those relationships at the moment have the potential to be very helpful, motivating, inspiring, but when they go wrong, at this point in time when people are quite disconnected from other colleagues, they can create a lot of pressure in terms of well-being. So I think that's where I would, if I was going to put any time into it and I was in your shoes, that's where I would focus. I think the other thing that you can never minimize, and actually there's somebody at NAHT who said this to me when I joined the sector, is time. Time is so precious to everybody at the moment, and that point about flexibility, how much autonomy you can give people over their time to arrange and organize themselves, I think is a massive, potentially a massive win for well-being, to the extent that that is possible with the constraints of needing to be in the classroom that obviously exist.
Thank you, Sinead. Andrew?
I would just add, of course, hopefully our website now, the section on there called Headwell, which is our blog post now, it's beginning to fill out with some really good pieces on there where heads have been sharing the sorts of things that they've been doing in their schools that have helped promote well-being. So I think the very first one that we put out was by Elaine Rees, who is the chief exec of I think 120 odd schools up in Liverpool, a group that have sort of got together and put well-being right at the very heart of their improvement strategy. And there's some really good stuff in there in terms of what they're doing. We've got a couple of weeks ago, Narinda Gill put one out. I think it was Elevate Trust she works for. Some really good strategies that they've been using across their schools there to make sure, again, that well-being and mental health are built in, and that they're systemic, and that everything sort of rides through those. There's a blog on there by Chris Foley, who's a head teacher of a school up north, and he's got some really good stuff on there that he's used in his secondary school. And then just recently, Maggie Farrer, some of you may be aware or know of Maggie. Maggie used to be a director at the National College for School Leadership when it was first set up, and she runs her own company doing a lot of really good work on well-being, and she's got some good strategies on there that we can go to. So I would urge any of you out there, like I said earlier, if you've got something that's working in your schools, no matter how small and simple. Quite often, the really simple stuff is what works most effectively when it comes to making sure that everyone is well. Let us know, and we'd love to share them on the website.
Thanks, Andrew. And again, Elaine has shared a suggestion on there as well. So thank you for that. So there were some comments actually put in the chat during the presentations, thanking people for reminding them of things that they already knew. But also, obviously, there's some new information here. But that point about being reminded, Tim Gallagher has put a question here saying heads often are reluctant to take the advice that they would give to others. How can we change this tendency?
Quite often, I end up saying to head teachers, if a member of staff was telling you that, what would you say? Because that is just the real problem. And it's a problem with the nature of the job, isn't it? Because the job is to protect and to develop all the staff. And I have this analogy of headship's a bit like being a sponge, in that you're soaking up all the nasty stuff that's coming from the top in order to protect what's going on underneath, and you filter what's necessary in order to keep everybody calm and happy. And of course, in a pandemic, that's extra true, isn't it? But that sponge just becomes absolutely sodden. It becomes absolutely sodden, and it needs to be wrung out. And sometimes, sometimes head teachers will say to staff when they've reached that point, stop, do nothing, stop worrying about it, take the evening off, don't prepare your lessons, don't do this, we will sort it out, you just need a break. And heads need someone to say that to them. And because they don't take the advice they give other people, they continue to allow that sponge to get wetter and wetter and wetter. And we need to do it to each other. And I was very conscious when Sinead was talking about, spotting things in other people and listening to what other people tell you that they've spotted in you. And I think that's really good advice. And I just think that we need to do it to each other more.
Thank you. Sinead.
I would love to imagine, I don't know how you'd make this happen other than, mandating it. And I know everybody needs another bit of regulation, right? So this is a great idea already. That was a joke in case anyone's sitting at home thinking I was serious. But I think we need to take the step around discussing the use of support, almost mandating the use of support. I frankly don't believe that there's a school leader in the country that wouldn't get some value out of having some support. So the idea that it is exceptional to say I've used support is kind of upside down. And, it needs to be the other way up, frankly. But I think there is leaders by and large, and I think school leaders even more, have a very strong sense of, being strong. They carry the staff team, they carry the children and young people, and now in pandemic, to Roz's point, to carry the community. And I think that's a massive, massive piece that's wrapped up in the identity of school leaders. So I think, in my ideal world where we mandate that everybody has to utilize some form of support, whether it's coaching, mentoring, a headrest, a peer support group, a bit of external supervision, whatever it is. But you become odd if you're not using it because it's seen as core to your professional practice. That's I think kind of where we need to head in a funny way.
Andrew.
I think also it's down to going back to the culture of the way that we run our schools. I'm sure many of you have read the really good stuff by Matthew Saeed about black box thinking, and he talks about the importance of having kind of an open feedback loop. And one of the things that we're not good at, irrespective of taking on board any advice about well-being, as a profession, we just need to be better at open loop feedback. And I think one of the key issues is, of course, the accountability system that we operate in, where it's the stakes are so high that as heads we're just so reluctant to open up. And the Pandora's box for us in many ways is just best kept shut all the time. And I think that's something culturally that we've got to change as we reset the system when we return back after the pandemic. And again, I think it goes back to governing bodies. I think a lot of this can be eased by having, for example, appraisal frameworks that are less about cliff edge, year-end reliability on assessment data, and more about evidence that throughout the year people are open to growth, that they're improving, that they're changing, that they're looking to support and work with others, how they made a difference. All these sorts of things can be put in place, but of course they're very, very difficult to measure. And that often is the problem, because we tend to be fixated on only doing things that we can measure easily and then put into graphs and put out in benchmarks, and it makes us somehow feel better. So I would, strongly urge that when we go back, I think the brave schools and the brave heads will be those that embrace this, a new way of really looking at how we just run our schools.
Sinead?
Natalie, just picking up a comment that Bernadette made, a really good one in the chat, which I recognise, that there are plenty of leaders who would be open to having support but feel like they can't justify the spend on themselves. And I think it's really, really important to address that. And I completely, I run a small charity. Anything that I spend on my development or peer support or anything else comes out of the charity. I take I've managed to get a bit for free, but I take the decision very seriously if I was going to spend a couple of £100, to be honest. And I think that is the same as with school leaders. But I also think that in the leadership position, so much is dependent on you being able to do the best job you can do. And the difference that it will make if you are well supported, we know from the literature, is significant. You'll get estimates of anything between return on investment being anything from 4 to 16 quid per pound spent on well-being. I think, and I've looked at a lot of the models that lie beneath them. I think it's probably quite reasonable to assume that there's a return on investment that's pretty chunky when it comes to the well-being of the leader, because they have such a significant impact on every other relationship in the school, and ultimately, of course, and again, it's in the literature, on pupil outcomes. Even if you're not directly in a class with children and young people, as the leader, your role has a very, very direct impact on what's accomplished in the school. So I think I really feel for people who think, who are wrestling with, should I spend that money? But I would say to you, with all my learning on this subject, it's a false economy to not spend there. And obviously be choiceful what you spend. You don't need to spend thousands of pounds. You can spend in the hundreds of pounds and get outstanding support. So just be thoughtful, but I think don't hesitate.
Thank you, Sinead. I think also you mentioned governors, Andrew. There's a new focus on making sure that schools do have wellbeing governors, and that to remember that they're there for the staff and the school leader. It's not just looking at the wellbeing of the pupils. So yeah, definitely something to develop. Right, thank you. The next question asks if there are examples of good practice in schools collated anywhere, which Andrew, you've already touched on with your website. We've had a comment saying the Education Endowment Foundation or Sutton Trust. Is there anything else anyone would like to add to that? Or we could move on to the next question. We've only got about 10 minutes left. Okay. No? Right. So the next question comes from Manjeet Kaur. The position you're describing for head teachers is also apparent for students, NQTs and RQTs. Additionally, children reception last year and this year. Paul Whiteman described this period as damage to education. Is there a holistic strategy to creating a way to deal with this situation? Andrew.
I think the point Manjit raises there is a really good one, because I guess what we're talking about here is that if we are going to have a long-term strategy about addressing the situation with head teachers, take the point previously about the fact that as heads, we're all very good at giving advice, but we're not so good at taking it. Maybe then we need to accept that these student NQTs and RQTs in 10 years time, 7 years time, whatever it may be, will be the future head teachers, and that we need to be targeting and working with them now, giving them strategies and modelling and making it clear to them that it's perfectly acceptable to acknowledge that you've got issues with well-being, and that it's perfectly acceptable to reach out and to ask for support and help both within your school and outside that school, so that when they then become a head teacher, they take that with them and it's kind of embedded within their mindset. I think at the moment, though, some of us are probably too long in the tooth to change our ways. But and I think the other issue there about this holistic strategy, I think, you know, with anything to do with strategy, you've got to be clear about what is the objective. And I'm not entirely sure what the objective is then around well-being. I think we need to have that conversation to sit down and be clear precisely about what it is that we want to create and what we want this to look like in terms of head teacher well-being, because, you know, realistically, we're never going to get rid of it. I mean, we'll be foolish and naive to think that running any organization doesn't come with stress, and that at times your well-being is going to feel, you know, as Roz said, you know, you're going to feel like that sponge that's completely sodden. I guess we've just got to find ways of acknowledging that that is happening, that the sponge is getting wet, as opposed to only dealing with it when the sponge is just completely soaked and it's too late to deal with it. So what are the triggers, and who's looking out for us, and how can we look out for each other, whether that's the governing body, whether it's a named governor or somebody else in the system. Well, that's something that we've really got to think about.
Thank you. Sinead.
I would, for once, say Paul's understated it. If what he said was the comment was damage to education, I think that was it. I think that what we've seen is and what we're seeing is damaging society as a whole. It's damaging the country quite profoundly, and I think that it is not understood in policymaking circles. It is not understood the extent to which mental health and well-being affect learning and outcomes. And I think that probably speaks to us needing to you know, do the definitive piece of research that knocks any doubt out of the mind of anyone. I fully believe there is a very detailed body of research that makes the case quite clearly, but it obviously doesn't make it clearly enough for all policymakers to sign up to it. So I think there has to be a kind of irrefutable case for why this needs to be looked at in the round. The fact that there's a generation of children and young people now who will be profoundly affected by a variety of outcomes from the period we've been through is wrapped in that. And as we look at, you know, it's Children's Mental Health Week next week, the staff well-being matters here as well, because if you put children in an environment that is unreasonably stressed, that is more stressed than other environments, you can't be surprised if children and young people begin to absorb that. You know, and again, there's plenty of evidence and data around it. So personally, I think to the point about a kind of holistic response, I think we do need a fairly significant reset. We need to go back to some basic questions. This is far beyond my pay grade now, but we need to go back to some fundamental questions about what the purpose of education is. And we need to bring the insight from the vast literature that exists around what does damage and what does good. And I think, you know, we don't have to look very far. The Welsh government has rewritten its whole kind of approach to education. They've put well-being as a core pillar to the education system. And I think that's the direction of travel that's required. When we look at what's happening with the mental health of children and young people, I think it's only a question of time before that happens here too. I just wish it was a question of less time than appears to be on the horizon.
Thank you, Sinead. I think that's a really important point to make, and also that's been acknowledged in the comments as well. Great point, thank you. Charlene Gethin has also added some advice for the person who was asking regarding how to access support, an example of joining and federating with another school. So there's a leadership that can be shared there. But thank you for everyone who has asked questions, fed back on them and given their own points of view as well. I've just brought into the panel Tim Gallagher, who is the Regional Secretary for the West Midlands. He's just going to come on screen to close the event with a few words. I want to thank all of you, Andrew, Roz, Sinead, Bernadette and Tim, for joining us today. I think it's been, hopefully it's been a very useful experience for the people that have been able to attend. As I said, we'll be sharing it with everybody who was able to register as well afterwards, and the slides which Sinead used as well, we'll be able to make those available. I think the question that was left there was about the opening hours of Headrest, which has been addressed. Basically, when needed seems to be the response at the moment. So thank you for sharing all your contact details as well. And yeah, I'll just sort of end after Tim, but here's Tim for a couple of minutes. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute, Tim, sorry.
Can I thank our speakers this afternoon, because whilst there were only 75, a big 75 that were actually hearing you live, I know for a fact many others are going to be watching it on recording later. And I also know that we've got representatives from other regions here that would like to have similar sessions in their regions too. So can I thank you, Sinead, can I thank you for setting it out across the lockdowns? You painted the picture of how we've progressed or regressed, and you've given us much food for thoughts. And I think it's really important that we revisit your slides and we revisit the things that you've said, because actually there was a lot of good stuff there. And can I thank Ros and Andrew for putting up almost like this charitable gesture of using their experiences as head teachers in a way that is absolutely fulfilling for those who are new to the job. It's really, really important. And I do know that because I deal with a lot of head teachers and a lot of senior leaders in casework, they may appear on the outside to be very strong and confident and assured in what they do, but it is a very thin veneer. And actually only those that have actually been in headship know how thin that veneer can be, more at some times than others. So can I thank you all for your commitment to our course today. Thank you ever so much. And the thing that I will leave with is the business of self-care is not self-indulgence. I think that's a really important one. We need to look after ourselves, because if we don't look after ourselves, we can't look after others. Thank you, team panelists today. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you, but all of you. So thank you as well to those of you who've attended. Obviously, we realise that your days are so busy, and for you to make the time to come and join us has been, you know, we're very grateful for that. Thank you for completing the poll. We're going to take that information away. It definitely looks like some further wellbeing sessions are going to be welcome. And the next briefing that we have arranged in the West Midlands is for March the 24th. There'll be communication around that. That's going to be more of a kind of legal focus. We're going to be looking at getting some of the team from HQ involved with that. But as I say, look out for the programme later on in the year. Have a great afternoon. Please take some time to look after yourselves, as has been the point we've been trying to drive home. Take care. Bye.